Section 6. Do-it-yourself. Introduction to do-it-yourself, DIY. I've had various interests in my life, some of which became obsessions. Cycling, photography, fishing, canoeing, carpentry, gardening, baseball, tennis, music, singing, and DIY. I took DIY to a more extreme level when I undertook to refurbish our old house in Ottawa. The house became a symbol of my passion for DIY. When something needs building or fixing, my first impulse is to figure out whether I can do it myself. I've done plumbing, plastering, drywalling, roofing, landscaping, bricklaying, and painting with brush, roller, and spray gun. I've rewired and replumbed an entire house, repaired stucco, rebuilt structure, and insulated with loose fill, bad insulation, and spray foam. I've installed new windows and doors, and done finish and rough carpentry. I'm better at rough. If I've missed anything on this DIY list, it's probably because I forgot to include it, not because I haven't tried it. DIY fits my style very well because of my nothing is too much trouble approach. DIY can be a lot of trouble and take a lot of time, but I'm always inclined to do it myself. Zen and the art of DIY. I think of my wish to do something myself rather than hire someone else to do it as a very practical, even endearing quality. My wife thinks of it more as a compulsion. I have to admit that there can be some negative consequences when I do it myself. The work is almost never done as well as a good professional would do it. In certain jobs, if I'm really careful, I can achieve 80 to 90% of the quality of a good professional. Also, the work usually takes longer, especially when other things intrude, such as family, work, sport, or volunteer commitments. On the positive side, it usually costs much less than if a professional were to do it, and we usually know where the worker is, for example, whether he's working on the job in question, watching TV, having a nap, or away at a croquet tournament. Finally, and I regard this as positive, though others may not, I was able to buy good tools for my workshop with some of the money saved by not having to pay for someone else's labor. I built up a wonderful collection of tools, ranging from hand tools inherited from my maternal grandfather to modern stationary power tools and hand power tools. I love tools, and I'm often inspiring to move ahead with a job because of the joy I get when working with a high-quality tool that's just right for the job. DIY can be frustrating for both the doer and the one who has to put up with the disruption. Not that hiring a pro to do the work is always free of problems. Sometimes you get a bad contractor and the work is not done well, or problems turn up later. Even if you find a first-rate contractor, they are often so busy with other jobs that your job can sometimes sit for weeks without anything being done. All in all, DIY isn't so bad if you have the inclination to do it and are willing to learn. By the way, more and more women are turning to DIY, so much so that manufacturers of hand power tools are now designing them with women in mind. These design considerations include the size, weight, and color of the tools. This has coincided with the development of cordless power tools and improved battery technology. For example, the increased power and lighter weight of lithium-ion batteries has been a benefit to all. My inspiration for DIY did not come from my father's side, except perhaps in a negative way. He and my paternal grandfather were terrible at fixing things. Everywhere you looked on our farm, things were tied together with wire, even barbed wire. And when a small nail wouldn't do the job, they looked for a bigger nail. I resolved not to be like that, and instead took positive inspiration from my mother, who was quite good at fixing things, and from my relatives on her side of the family, who could build and fix almost anything. My maternal grandfather, William Evraw, Grandpa Evraw, was a pioneer who applied for and established a homestead farm near Isabella, Manitoba. This was the farm where my mother was born and lived until she moved away for teacher training and various teaching positions, including in Russell, Manitoba. Grandpa Evraw, whose story appears in several passages in these pages, was an exceptional man who, in addition to operating a successful farm, made a contribution not only to his community, but to the entire province of Manitoba. A feature of Grandpa Evraw's successful farming operation was a well-equipped workshop. It was one of the legacies he passed along to his daughter Jessie and her husband Bob Scarth, who became the next generation of the family to take over the farm. I saw the workshop as a kid several times when I visited there. The shop was not electrified at the time, so various stationary power tools were powered by flat belts running from pulleys on a line shaft situated near the ceiling of the workshop. The line shaft was powered by a stationary gasoline engine sitting outside the shop. The shop had a forge, so it could also function as a blacksmith shop. It was a fascinating place where my cousin Barry and I spent time whenever my family and I came to visit. Clearly, the maternal side of my family helped inspire my interest in DIY. Post-stressed beam. There's potential for a lot of creativity in DIYing. For example, I developed a way of building a beam so it would carry a load across a longer span than a store-bought beam would, and at a fraction of the cost. I got the idea from the way guitars are made. Well-made guitars have a curved rod called a truss rod built into the neck to counteract the pulling force of the strings. The rod has a nut or a socket at one end, which when tightened, forces the truss rod to try to straighten, thus bending the guitar's neck backwards against the pull of the strings. The objective here is to adjust the neck so the strings stay at the proper height above the frets. The first opportunity to try this approach came in 1982, 2 years after Carol and I and our 4 kids moved to Ottawa after returning from our time in Botswana. The move involved selling our house in Saskatoon and buying one in Ottawa. The house we bought in Ottawa had been built in 1915 and needed to be refurbished top to bottom. I thought I was up to the challenge, although I didn't realize how much of a challenge it would be. There was a garage at the back of the property, accessible from a back lane. Back lanes are very unusual in Ottawa, but we had one. The garage was leaning severely to the east and was crying to be torn down. I decided to rebuild it instead, partly because the city's building code would not have allowed me to build a new one on the same footprint, and partly because at that time we couldn't have afforded to build a new one anyway. My first step toward rebuilding that garage was to deal with the lean. I did so with a series of cables and a come-along, a hand-operated winch. I strung the cables from low on the west wall to high on the east wall, and used the come-along to correct the lean. I did so by moving from cable to cable, using the come-along to shorten the reach of each cable. The lean gradually became less pronounced as the work proceeded. I remember a neighbor from across the back lane coming out of his house to say, "That'll never work." Half an hour later, the garage was standing vertical for the first time in decades. The neighbor went back into his house and never spoke to me again. Next, I decided to remove the whole east wall of the garage and replace it with a beam built using the truss rod system. The beam had to span almost 19 feet and be able to carry half the weight of the roof, plus whatever load of snow and ice might accumulate in winter. I started with 4 lengths of 2 by 10 planks, 2 16 feet long and 2 12 feet long. I fastened the 4 pieces together with a 4-foot overlap in the middle, resulting in a beam 20 feet in length overall. The resulting beam would have been much too weak to support the load over its length without some sort of reinforcing. This is where the truss rod approach came in. I ran a 22-foot piece of half-inch reinforcing rod along each side of the beam and forced the rods to dip down 8 inches below the middle of the beam. The ends of the rods ran through holes in a piece of heavy angle iron at each end of the beam. I threaded the ends of the rods and spun 2 nuts onto each end of each rod. The result was a double truss rod system made out of rebar. The total cost of materials was about $40, hundreds of dollars less than I would have had to pay for a commercial beam of the same length. The arrangement worked amazingly well. In fact, it was possible to tighten the truss rod so much that the roof curved upward in the middle. I adjusted it so there was a slight upward curve in the roof so that any load of snow would do no more than bring it down to flat. My civil engineering son, Kevin, told me that I had developed a post-stressed beam. It was good to have a name for it. I also used the truss rod approach inside the house, where I was able to correct and support a sag in the roof above the storage room on the 3rd floor. I have never heard of anyone else using this approach, professional contractor or otherwise. This is surprising, because I found that the beams were cheap, easy to build, and took up less vertical space than a conventional wooden beam. A steel beam would accomplish the same thing, but would have been very expensive and too heavy for one person to handle working alone. This approach to construction is unconventional and involves thinking outside the box. But the built-up beams I installed in our old Ottawa house are still doing their job 40 years later. First time, every time. One of the problems with DIY is that you're often using a technique for the first and probably only time. Professionals in the building trades tend to specialize in plumbing or electrical or drywall, etc., and do the same or similar work over and over. The good ones become expert in their field and are a joy to watch. They are fast and efficient and do top quality work. They earn good money and they deserve it. Less common are the generalists in the field. They can turn their hand to anything. The good ones are amazingly talented. I'm a hardcore DIYer in that I'm willing to try almost anything. In fact, I've been at it so long that I actually have had to do a number of projects more than once. I've become better at DIY over the years and can usually produce a satisfactory result. Certainly, my DIY efforts have saved us a lot of money in labor costs. Tom Sawyer lives again. I was painting our living room in Saskatoon when our friends Jim and Marlene Howard dropped by. I was using a roller with an extension handle to paint our living room ceiling. Everything was going very well. The paint was covering well, and there was little mess, and as we visited, I continued painting. Apparently, I made it look so easy that Jim, by no means a do-it-yourselfer, thought he could save some money by painting one of their bedrooms. He headed off to the hardware store to buy paint brushes and roller equipment. He came home ready to start, but not being an experienced painter, decided to get his feet wet, so to speak, by starting in the closet. Bad idea. The gentle reader might take note that a closet is absolutely the most difficult place to paint. There is almost no room to maneuver a paintbrush, let alone a roller and tray. It is almost impossible to paint a wall and turn around to paint another wall without brushing up against the wall you just painted. The pros hate painting closets. First-timers who try it are likely to emerge matching the color of the paint they have been using. A couple of hours later, Jim emerged from the closet with, and I'm not exaggerating here, more paint on himself than he managed to get on the closet walls. He swore for 5 minutes flat, threw everything in the garbage, and checked the yellow pages under closet painters, and called a professional. The only phrase he used that can be repeated here in this family publication was "never again." Holy ceiling, Batman! The only other time my DIY approach sucked Jim in was when he and Marlene needed to hang a jolly jumper, which is a trade name for a baby swing in which you hope fondly to confine your toddler for more than 3 seconds while you prepare supper for your darling, hard-working husband, who will be home from work any minute. Gender imbalance intentional. To hang a jolly jumper from their kitchen ceiling, it was important that the ceiling hook for the jolly jumper be screwed into a ceiling joist, not just the drywall. Accordingly, I lent Jim my electric drill and a drill bit, and advised him on how, after determining which way the joists run, and with some judicious and gentle tapping with a hammer, to drill through the drywall into a joist above. Note, this was in the days before stud finders became de rigueur. Certainly he might have to drill a couple of test holes before finding a joint, but that would be worst case. I was wrong. Not only did Jim not find a joist after 2 or 3 holes, he never found one. He drilled many, many holes. In fact, there were very few sieves in the neighborhood that could have claimed as many holes as were in the Howard ceiling when Jim had finished. It was indeed an impressive display of determination, not to say speed and virtuosity, with an electric drill. If the objective had been to put as many holes as possible in as short a time as possible in a drywall ceiling, it would have been an exceptional accomplishment. Even Guinness World Records would have been impressed had it occurred to Jim to send in a submission. Unfortunately, it didn't occur to him. He was too busy looking in the yellow pages for jolly jumper installers. Western gable. Massive beams projected out under the overhanging roof of the western gable of our old Ottawa house. The peak of the roof was 38 feet above the ground, so some safety precautions clearly were called for, if I was going to work up there. To that end, I installed anchors at various points where I could secure a safety rope. I also got a safety belt with a rope grab mechanism that allowed the rope to pass through easily as I climbed up the ladder but would quickly halt any downward travel if I happened to fall. This system allowed me to feel secure as I worked high up on the house, doing everything from carpentry repairs to painting and washing windows. I don't have a fear of heights, but falling was to be avoided at all costs. We'll call you Sir. Most homeowners possess at least one ladder, usually a step ladder, sometimes an extension ladder, sometimes both. During my 32 years of working on our old 3-story Ottawa house, I acquired 2 step ladders, 3 extension ladders, 1 articulating ladder, and 3 step stools. It could be said that I had a ladder inventory. In our first summer in the old house, I needed to do some work high up on the west gable. I didn't own a long extension ladder at the time, so I decided to rent one, partly to save having to buy one and partly to get some experience with a long ladder before deciding whether or not to buy one. I prepared for my trip to Rental-X, the premier Ottawa tool rental company at the time, by measuring the height of the house where I would need to work. It measured 38 feet ground to ridge, the highest point of the roof. I knew that long extension ladders were available in various lengths, including 40 and 60 feet. It seemed to me that a 40-foot ladder would not be long enough to allow me to work safely at 38 feet. Even if the ladder was set up vertically, which is absolutely not recommended, it would not be long enough. I knew that a 40-foot extension ladder had 2 sections, and a 60-foot ladder had 3 sections. So I asked the Rental-X guy whether I would be able to handle a 60-foot ladder by myself. Well, if you can, he answered, we'll certainly call you Sir. In fact, the 40-foot heavy-duty aluminum ladder that I eventually bought was a real challenge for one person to handle alone. The first problem was simply to lift it and carry it around. It was heavy, about 70 pounds, and awkward to carry. The next problem was to raise it up into a vertical position and extend it. The first time I tried to raise it, I found that I couldn't upend the ladder without help. The ladder was 20 feet long when collapsed, so as I walked it up hand by hand to raise it up, the bottom would be overbalanced by the top and the feet would lift off the ground first. My solution was to temporarily affix a 40-pound cinder block to the foot of the ladder. This added enough weight to keep the bottom end on the ground as I raised the ladder. Then there was the problem of moving the ladder into position once it was upright. Picture it, in the unextended position, a 40-foot ladder is 20 feet tall. You are standing at the bottom with your 2 hands at about the 5-foot and 7-foot points. You then have to put the 5-foot hand down at the 3-foot level in order to lift the upright ladder into the desired position. As you do so, the ladder is doing its best to wave about and come crashing down again. But that's not all. Once in position, the ladder needs to be extended, which means holding it upright with one hand while pulling on the extending rope with the other. And the higher the ladder goes, the more difficult it becomes to keep it upright. Finally, after doing the job at hand, you have to do everything in reverse as you lower the ladder down and put it away. After all this effort, to get the ladder into position, I still had to do the work I got the ladder out for in the first place, whether washing windows, painting, or doing some carpentry 30 feet in the air. You could be forgiven for wondering whether this huge effort with the big ladder was worth it. The only way I can answer that is to say if I wanted to be able to maintain, repair, and refurbish that big old house myself, I had to be able to get access to all parts of it, including the upper parts. Safety belt. While I do not fear heights, I am not keen on falling, and took the necessary safety precautions when up on a ladder. I bought a safety belt with fall protection and 100 feet of rope. The belt featured a rope grab mechanism that allowed the rope to slide through freely as I climbed up the ladder, but unless I held a release lever open, the mechanism would instantly lock if I fell or began climbing down the ladder. See article Western Gable for more about safety precautions. DIY nerd. During my time working on the old house, I had an assortment of tool belts, including General Carpenter's tool belt wallets, as well as specialized belt wallets for cordless drills, cordless screwdrivers, etc. With my belts, when working away from my workshop, I could carry many of the tools I would need for any given job while leaving my hands free for climbing the ladder and doing the actual work. Not being content with that amount of tool carrying capacity, I set about searching the internet for a carpenter's apron. As I searched, I found out about carpenter's vests. They are made of heavy canvas with numerous pockets, top, bottom, back, and inside. When I get all geared up with 1 or 2 belts plus the vest, Each loaded up with all the tools and parts I expect to need for the job at hand, I am carrying 20 to 25 pounds of additional weight. If the job involves working up on a ladder, it means carrying all that additional weight up and down the ladder. Still, it's much safer to do it that way than to carry several tools in one hand while climbing the ladder with the other. I'm the first to admit, when fully outfitted with all that gear, I look like a complete nerd, albeit a rather special kind of nerd, a DIY nerd. It's important to note that nerds don't mind looking like nerds and are even secretly rather proud of it. That goes double for DIY nerds. We consider ourselves to be a rare and special bunch and are ready to tell people all about it in excruciating detail at the slightest provocation. I hope you're happy. I was up shingling the garage roof one day when a couple of kids from the other side of the wall of our semi-detached house came out into the back lane to shoot some basketball hoops. At one point, Allegra, the youngest one, about 7 at the time, said, "What are you doing up there, Ken?" "Shingling the roof," I said. "Why?" she asked. "Because the old shingles aren't in very good shape and I thought I should put on some new ones," I said. I carried on with my work until I heard a voice from down in the other neighbor's yard. It was Allegra, who had somehow found her way into the enclosed yard of the neighbor to the west. Allegra, arms folded across her chest, called up to me, "Well, I hope you're happy. I'm trapped." I replied, "I'm quite happy, thanks. It's nice of you to inquire." The next thing I knew, she had crossed over into our yard and announced that she was going to climb the fence to get back into her yard instead of using the gate leading to the front street. I said I didn't think she should do that because there were nails and slivers on the top of that fence and she might hurt herself. She stood there looking up at me, hands akimbo, arguing that she could climb the fence no problem. Now, one of my favorite tools is my air compressor and the various air tools that go with it. On this occasion, I was using an air-driven roofing nail gun with an air hose connected to the compressor on the ground below. One of the distinguishing features of that particular brand of air compressor is that it is very noisy when running and completely silent when not running. When the pressure gauge drops to a trigger point, the machine switches on, boosts the pressure back up to the required level, and shuts off. It happened that Allegra was standing right beside the silent air compressor as she argued with me. She was just about to launch into yet another argument when the compressor decided at that moment that a pressure boost was needed, resulting in a very loud blat. Allegra took off like a rabbit for the gate and home, bringing the argument to an abrupt end. Amazingly, the same thing happened again a year later. I was again doing another shingling job, this time on the roof of a new bicycle shed I had built. Allegra came into the yard and again stood beside the silent compressor and asked, "Where's Carol?" "She's out," I said. "Can I go into the house?" she asked. "No," I said. "Why not?" she asked. "Because there's no one in there," I said. "I know my way around," she said. So there she was again, arms folded across her chest, about to intensify her argument, when, you guessed it, the compressor fired up again. This time she didn't panic quite as much, having achieved a much more mature age of 8, but said in a semi-hysterical way, "I'm going home now," and made a hasty but dignified run for the gate. All of which points to a largely unknown and unadvertised feature of air compressors. They can be of considerable help when you're losing an argument with an assertive young woman. This Old House. The title of this story does not refer to the TV program, but to just one particular old house that was for many years our home in the glebe in Ottawa. Upon returning from Botswana and settling temporarily in a rented house in Ottawa, we decided that we wanted to live near the center of the city and not have to commute to and from work, especially by car. I began looking for a house simply by riding my bicycle around various central Ottawa neighborhoods. I happened to ride by the house 30 minutes after the owners put a for sale sign in the window. I knocked on the door and was welcomed in to have a look, learned the asking price, and called Carol, who was in Saskatoon with the girls selling our house there, to come to Ottawa to have a look. We both liked the house, made an offer that was accepted, and became owners of our old house that was to be our Ottawa home for the next 32 years. The house was not well built in 1915 and first occupied in 1916. We bought it in 1980 and sold it in 2012. The location on Browns Inlet is superb, and the house is charming, but at the time we bought it, it had not been upgraded and had major problems. I was intrigued by the idea of refurbishing an old house and looking for a challenge. I certainly found one. The old house was the western half of a larger building made up of 2 semi-detached houses joined by a common wall. The whole building was constructed at the same time, so the two houses began with the same features, both positive and negative. Some of the problems originated in the World War I era in which the house was built. For example, the electrical system featured knob and tube wiring, in common use at the time but a seriously inadequate system today that no longer meets the current building code. Other problems were the result of poor construction techniques, even for the 1915 period, such as not providing proper structural support for the upper stories. Many old-time builders had common sense that made up for a lack of government oversight. The ones who built our house were either ignorant or didn't want to spend the money, or both. The house became a symbol of my passion for DIY. When something needs building or fixing, my first impulse is to figure out whether I can do it myself. I've done plumbing, plastering, drywalling, roofing, landscaping, bricklaying, and painting with brush roller and spray gun. I rewired and replumbed the entire glebe house, repaired stucco, rebuilt parts of the structure, and insulated with loose fill, bat insulation, and spray foam. I installed new windows and doors and did finish and rough carpentry. I'm better at rough. I hired external contractors for some of the work, but did most of it myself. If I've missed anything on this DIY list, it's probably because I forgot to include it, not because I haven't tried it. Even the search for a house was something of a DIY project for me. Here's some history about the old house. Around 1907, a farm was subdivided into housing lots, and the farmers set about building some houses. As noted above, the farmer and his helpers apparently didn't know much about construction because they built a number of structural problems into the house. This led to some nasty surprises as I worked to upgrade the house. For example, as I was running the electrical wiring for the light in the middle of the dining room ceiling, a great sheet of plaster shattered and fell on me and everything around me. After I dusted myself off, I could see the cause of the collapse. A broken ceiling joist was pressing down on the lath and plaster of the ceiling, so as soon as I disturbed it, it came crashing down. I then had to tear down more than 1/3 of the dining room ceiling, jack the broken joist into place so I could sister it, attaching a reinforcing joist to it. The ceiling joist had broken because the bedroom wall above had been built with no extra support directly below, such as a reinforced joist or a load-bearing wall. The original poor construction made for a lot of extra work as I set about fixing problems and making improvements. The foundation also didn't look good. It was crumbling and chunks had fallen off in numerous places. My friend, the late Rob Dumont, a knowledgeable friend, looked at it with me and agreed that it didn't look strong. We agreed that I should build an inside support wall on all exterior parts of the foundation. I put in forms for a substantial footing and invited some guys in for a concrete pouring and beer drinking party. The ready-mix truck operator directed his chute through one of the basement windows, and the four of us roared around the basement with wheelbarrows, filling the forms with concrete. I used 2x8 lumber to build the support wall between the new footings and the joists above. Finally, I insulated between the joists and covered them with drywall, all of which resulted in a warmer basement with a much stronger foundation. It was a lot of work, but it prevented a major structural catastrophe. See foundation collapse story below. Although the old house had many problems, it was in many ways the most comfortable home we have ever lived in. Amazingly, the word comfortable never appears when a house is being offered for sale or when a house design is presented in glowing terms in a newspaper or brochure. Instead, features such as vaulted ceilings, granite kitchen countertops, sunken living rooms, gas-fired fireplaces, and open-concept kitchen family rooms are promoted as the ultimate in home design. Some of these features may make a place comfortable, others may not, but there is usually no indication that anyone has given the question any thought. The author, Witold Rybczynski, in his book Home, expands upon the idea of comfort. Rybczynski is an architect who says the word comfort was mentioned only once in his architecture degree course, and this was in the narrow context of the comfort zone in heating and air conditioning systems. Rybczynski says comfort is difficult to define in any universal way. Since it's relatively easy to know when you're uncomfortable, one possibility would be to use a negative definition. Comfort is the absence of discomfort. Ultimately, Rybczynski describes a scene that most people would find comfortable. You sink into a soft chair with cushions positioned perfectly around you. You have in your hand a book that you are enjoying very much. A reading light is well positioned over one shoulder, and a cup of tea is within easy reach at a table on your elbow, but not so close that you risk knocking it over. This comfortable scene would work just as well for listening to music or as for reading. Some work was needed before our old house could live up to its potential for comfort. For example, there was no insulation in the walls or attic, and no effort had been made to seal the many air leaks around windows and doors and at the top of the foundation. Cold winter weather made the living room almost unlivable, especially with a strong downdraft of cold air coming down the chimney and out of our unsealed fireplace opening. We spent our first Christmas in comforters and sleeping bags, huddled against the cold. We hired a company to blow loose-fill insulation into the wall cavities, while I set about sealing air leaks, insulating the attic, and installing better windows and doors. Eventually, the house became much more comfortable to live in, even in severe winter weather. Maybe someday I'll write a book about our life in that house and the improvements we've made to it, but in the meantime, let me just say a few things about the house. The location was wonderful, with no houses across the street and a view of Brown's Inlet and the Rideau Canal. There was an open first-floor deck, a closed-in second-floor sunroom, and an open third-floor deck. While these features go somewhat beyond the idea of comfort, they certainly added to our enjoyment of living there. Another feature I'll mention is the ingle nook, better known in England as a chimney corner. An ingle nook is a small room with a fireplace accessed from a larger room. Our ingle nook was off the living room, through an archway. It came into its own after I closed off the door leading to the front entranceway and had a wood-burning fireplace insert and chimney liner installed. We spent many happy hours in our ingle nook, enjoying a meal or visiting with family and friends. Finally, I want to contrast modern homes with a lot of open space to older homes with discrete rooms. In modern homes, there would likely be a large room with a vaulted ceiling, an impressive stone fireplace, custom-built hardwood furniture, and massive upholstered sofas positioned around the room, more for show than for good conversation. The main advantage of open space in the living room of such a large home is the accommodation of big social gatherings, where people sit or stand around with easy access to food and drink, and the opportunity to circulate and visit with a range of people. In most homes, big social gatherings are relatively rare compared to family time, which is a more frequent and typical use of the living areas. To me, Rybczynski's idea of comfort seems to be reflected in a home for a small family group, a mother, father, and a couple of kids. Foundation collapse. One spring day, I was watering the lawn and went out after dark to turn the water off. I reached for the spigot, but couldn't find it. I sensed that something was wrong and went to get a flashlight. The flashlight revealed a nightmare, a great gaping hole where the foundation used to be, with the spigot waving weakly about in midair at the end of its copper water pipe. Part of the foundation had collapsed into the basement. Even for this particular optimist, this could not be counted as good news. My solution: can't do anything about it tonight anyway, might as well go to bed and get a good night's sleep and have a look at it in the morning. Everything looks brighter in the morning, right? The situation was sure to look a lot better in the daylight. It didn't. What I saw the night before was confirmed. A 4-foot section of the old poured rubble foundation had collapsed inward. In addition, some of the brick veneer on the wall above had also come down, and there were cracks in the mortar around the bricks in all directions. The cause of this calamity was that the copper pipe leading from the supply line inside the basement to the outside tap had frozen and burst during the winter. The foundation was poured rubble held together with a lime bonding agent, which is water-soluble, making it vulnerable to a water leak like this. So I called my old Botswana buddy, Cesar Prompsima, to come and have a look. He agreed to work with me to rebuild the foundation. It was the hardest job I ever did on the house. My renovation/rebuilding work on the old house involved both fixing problems and making improvements. The need to fix problems arose because the house wasn't well built in the first place. A badly built building begins to fail faster than a well-built one. As it does so, doors and windows stop working smoothly or at all, walls develop cracks, Trim pieces no longer fit well, and the appearance of the house deteriorates inside and out. Once when I was installing the central vacuum cleaning system, I found that some joists had pulled away from a beam under the floor of the second-floor hallway. I elected to take up the maple flooring, build a hoist system, pull up and bolt the joists to the beam using heavy angle irons, and put the flooring down again. Later, as I was rewiring the second floor of the house, I discovered that the east wall of the northwest bedroom had only 2x2 studs instead of the usual 2x4. That interfered with my plan to finish wiring that room with a 3-inch electrical box on the east wall. I had to take time to build that whole wall out simply so it would accommodate a 3-inch electrical box between the studs, enough to make a grown man cry. Simply so it would accommodate a 3-inch electrical box between the studs, enough to make a grown man cry. The folks on the other side of our east wall were our neighbors for the first 15 years we lived in that house. They put up with a lot of commotion. There was banging, shaking, and noise, especially when I was working on the common wall between our two houses. An indication of just how much they had to put up with came in 1990, when there was a 5.0 Richter scale earthquake in nearby western Quebec. As our house was shaking along with everyone else's, the lady on the other side of the wall said to her husband, "What's Ken Shipley doing now?" Surprisingly, or perhaps not so surprisingly, when we had another earthquake in 2002, the new neighbor on the other side of the wall accused me of causing the earthquake when the wife asked her husband what I was doing to cause all the shaking. When one has been blamed for 2 earthquakes, it's hard to know what to think. On the one hand, I've been unfairly accused. On the other hand, one should probably take a bit of fame wherever one can find it. Rewiring 27 Wilson Crescent. I had very little knowledge about what would be involved in upgrading the electrical wiring in an old house, so I dropped into a shop called Electromart. It turned out that the owners were 3 retired electrical contractors. They said if I bought my supplies from them, they would be happy to guide me through the process. They suggested I first sketch out a plan and talk to the building inspectors at City Hall. The City Hall guys were very helpful. They said normally they do only 2 inspections of an electrical job on a house, after the rough-in stage and after completion. However, in view of my lack of experience, they offered to do an extra inspection. If I would call them after doing the wiring on one floor, they would come and see how I was doing. I followed their advice, did the wiring on the 3rd floor, and called them after the rough-in work was done. The inspector had only 2 comments. He said, "You're following an American book, right?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "The Canadian system is simpler. You don't have to do all those pigtails." Technical term, sorry. Then he noted that I was planning to put a ground fault protected, another technical term, outlet on the 3rd floor deck. He said, "You aren't going to be out here on this deck in the rain, are you?" I said, "No." And he said, then it would be okay to save some money and use a regular outlet. The advice of the Electromart people was good enough to guide me as I snaked cables through walls and ceilings, attics and basement, installing 73 outlets, 36 switches, 12 ceiling fixtures, the main electrical panel, and a sub-panel on the 3rd floor. In doing so, I took the old house from its antiquated knob and tube system to a fully modern installation. I was careful to follow the electrical code of the time, including proper wiring for the stove, dryer, refrigerator, and kitchen counter wall outlets. It took me a full year and an estimated 1,900 hours. The original wiring was an old knob and tube system in which 2 separate wires ran side by side, not grounded, with therefore no grounded outlets. I installed a totally parallel system, leaving the old system operating until a new service was ready to be hooked up from the transformer on the pole in the back lane. When the Ottawa Hydro workers came to hook up the new panel, they said they'd never seen a parallel system before. The truth is I didn't know how else to do it. I also knew that the job was going to take me a long time, working in my spare time, and we needed a functioning electrical system in the meantime. I had no choice but to keep the old system in place until the new system was ready. The bottom line is that Ottawa Hydro approved my work when I finally completed it. Holy floor, Batman. Rewiring the kitchen was another challenge. First, there was no access to the crawl space under the kitchen. That meant I had to break through the concrete foundation wall in the northeast corner of the basement. I had to pound a hole large enough to crawl through so I could rewire as well as replumb the kitchen. Unusually for old houses, this one had a high basement, so I had to use a stepladder to climb up and crawl through the hole. Running electrical cables and installing outlet switch boxes in the wall we shared with our neighbors was tricky. First, the wall was constructed differently at different levels. It was concrete at the basement level, brick at the first floor and halfway up the second floor level, and frame the rest of the way up. I had to use surface-mounted outlets on the brick-filled sections, but I could use inset boxes where the sections were framed. There I had to take care not to cut through electrical cables belonging to the neighbor. Sometimes, when cutting through the lath and plaster to install a box, my saw bumped into the back of one of the neighbor's electrical boxes. Scary. But the scariest time of all was when I was running cables in the wall under the kitchens of the two homes. There I was, lying on my back in the crawl space, trying to figure out where to drill the holes for the various cables to be run up the wall to the kitchen floor outlets, stove, dishwasher, etc. There was only a flimsy partition between the houses, which didn't show exactly where the common wall was. I wanted to run the cables up through the 2x4 bottom plate of the wall. The problem was that from below I could only guess where the plate was. This was the procedure I followed, which didn't work. Drill a pilot hole. Scramble out of the crawl space, up the stairs to the kitchen to see where the hole showed through. No sign of the hole from above. Scramble back down to the basement and into the crawl space again and drill another hole. Scramble out of the crawl space again, up the stairs to the kitchen. Again, no sign of the second pilot hole. This process was repeated 5 times, and I still had not seen any of the pilot holes. Very puzzling. I finally called Jill, the resident teenager, and asked her to watch from up in the kitchen while I drilled yet another pilot hole. I said, okay, I'm going to drill a hole 12 inches west of where I've drilled the other holes. I figured this would place the hole about 12 inches into our side of the house. That would give me a point from which to measure back east to the common wall. So I drilled 12 inches west of the other holes, and Jill said, perfect. I said, what? And she said, perfect. It's right where you want it. Moment of silence while the awful truth sank in. I had drilled the first 5 pilot holes through the floor of our neighbor's kitchen, and their floor, in contrast to ours, which was only a plywood subfloor at this point, was covered with expensive vinyl sheet flooring. Panic stations. So I clambered out of the crawl space in great haste and rushed next door. Their bored teenage daughter answered the bell in response to my request to have a look in their kitchen and said whatever and went back upstairs. I went into their kitchen with great trepidation. No sign of any holes in their floor. Pulled out their stove, still no holes. Then I realized my good fortune. I had been drilling below one of their lower kitchen cabinets, so the drill bit had only penetrated into the dead space between the kitchen floor and the floor of the cabinet. They'd never know unless they removed that cabinet, something not likely to happen, as their kitchen had been recently renovated. Renovating an old house can be very tricky when the neighbor's house is only 3 inches away. The neighbors didn't hear this story until they had safely sold their house and moved away. Then it became a good dinner party story. Kitchen plumbing. The main floor kitchen had a number of problems before we renovated it. For example, there was only one sink, located in the corner adjacent to the basement and against the neighbor's wall. The drainage system serving that sink was a nightmare. The plumbing stack, the main drain for the whole house, ran down the middle of the south wall of the house, which meant that the drain from that kitchen sink had to run across the basement to the stack. Unfortunately, the drain consisted of a 2¼ inch cast iron pipe running horizontally across the basement ceiling to the stack, a distance of about 18 feet. A horizontal drain is likely to be problematic, and so it was. Even trying to run dishwasher down the sink would lead to problems, as the slightest hint of grease in the water would plug the line. Dealing with our kitchen drainage problem was a priority. I tried to run boiling water down it, but the problem persisted. I then tried a plumber's snake in it, which caused the line to burst. The pipe had rusted through over the years and would have to be replaced. The next drainage disaster appeared at the bottom of the stack, when sewage water began burbling up through the floor. The plumbing stack had also rusted out. I engaged my good friend Sitsa Pronsma to help me replace the basement section of the stack. We decided to tackle the job in the late evening, telling everyone to refrain from using the toilet until we had the job done. We had to break through the concrete floor to find where the stack had failed. We replaced that basement section of the stack with 6-inch ABS pipe, while at the same time providing a connection for the new drain that now sloped along the basement wall from the kitchen sink. This job had to be coordinated with the kitchen renovation that was underway at the time. Dishwasher installation. I roughed in a space for a dishwasher when I rebuilt the kitchen, but we didn't have the money to install one at the time. We simply put in some sliding storage racks in the space and washed our dishes in the sink by hand. When we decided to downsize and sell the house, we knew the time had come to install a dishwasher. We thought that would make the house more saleable. The bad news was that the dishwashers apparently had increased in size since I had measured them 25 years before. Not by much, mind you, but having a space a 1/4 inch too low and a 1/4 inch too narrow caused me a ridiculous amount of work before the new dishwasher would fit in. I had to actually fold myself into the space and then chisel and rasp little bits of wood off the inside of the space until there was enough room to slide the dishwasher in. I felt like a cave dweller in my own kitchen. The roof. The asphalt shingles were more than 10 years old when we bought the house. The shingles had a 15-year rating, but I found that a certain latex roof coating could be used to extend the life of asphalt shingles. It could be applied with a paint roller. Here's a way to save some money, I said to myself. So that's how I stretched out the life of our shingles for the next 20 years. The steep part of our roof was so steep that I found it prudent to tie myself on when working on that part of the roof. That way I could work while standing right at the edge of the roof, confident that if I did slip I wouldn't fall very far. A south-facing dark brown roof can get very hot in the heat of summer. One hot summer day I was happily rolling on the coating when I noticed that I was slipping slowly backward down the roof. Not only that, but a lump seemed to be developing under each boot. Upon investigating, I found that the roof was so hot that it had softened the soles of my boots to the point where the first layer of the soles was peeling off and rolling up under each boot. That's pretty hot, I said to myself. I stopped for a drink of water, cut off the rolled up portions from the bottoms of my boots, and went back up to the roof to work. Bricklaying beginner. The structure of our old house was wood frame with exterior finishes of brick veneer at the first floor level, stucco on the second floor, cedar shake shingles in the third floor gable, plus vertical cedar on 2 newer first floor sections. Much of it needed repair at various stages, but we tried to preserve the original appearance as much as possible. In the process, I learned something about bricklaying, stucco repair, and repairing cedar shingles. The brick wall on the front corner of the house was in bad shape. Many of the brick ties holding the brick to the wooden structure behind had rusted out and broken, allowing the wall to pull away to the point where we were concerned that it might fail and tip away from the house. That section needed rebuilding. The wall area was about 120 square feet in size, and I couldn't find a bricklayer willing to take on such a small job. Bricklayers are skilled tradesmen and much in demand on bigger jobs. I couldn't get anyone even to come and give me a quotation. I called my friend Sitza, who had helped me rebuild after part of the foundation collapse some years before, see foundation collapse story, but he said his days of clambering about on ladders and scaffolding were about over. I then asked if he thought I could do the job myself. He said I thought I could, so I decided to try. I started by taking the wall down brick by brick, cleaning off the mortar, and setting the bricks aside. My first consideration was to be very careful not to break the bricks, because by then it was impossible to find new brick to match. I had an ace in the hole because in the foundation collapse job, Sitza had used thicker mortar joints than the original builder, so we ended up with about 100 bricks left over. If the job was to look authentic, I knew it was important to use original bricks. Another consideration is the mortar. The first issue is mortar color, which has to be matched to the brick. I had mortar color on hand and a recipe for the color mix. The next consideration is mortar strength. Old brick is not as strong as modern brick. Therefore, it is important not to use a Portland-based mortar, which would be too strong for the old brick. If a wall cracks, you want the crack to follow the mortar line rather than go through the brick. Mortar is a lot cheaper and easier to repair than brick, so I found a supplier that would sell me the right mortar and set to work. The job turned out okay, not quite up to the standards of a good professional, and certainly much slower. The job was good enough to meet my usual quality target. The house next door was being renovated at the time, and the contractor called over a couple of times to tell me I was doing a good job. The front of our house then looked pretty good. Bloody mortar. At one point, when I was repairing the brick under the dining room window bump out, I straightened up without thinking and gave myself a nasty bang on the head. The bang broke the skin right through the ball cap I was wearing. Head wounds bleed profusely, and this one was no exception. Pretty soon I had a considerable stream of blood coming off the peak of my cap. That posed a dilemma. I didn't want to stop work because I had a nice batch of mortar mixed up, ready to use, and darkness was setting in. I knew if I stopped work, I wouldn't be able to finish the job, and my precious batch of mortar, worth perhaps 75 cents, would be useless. On the other hand, I was concerned about not dripping blood onto the surface of the brick, where the stain might be hard to remove. Thus I had to be careful to direct the drips into the mortar where I knew it wouldn't be a problem. The mortar was reddish in color anyway. So there I was, working away to my heart's content, dealing with the dripping blood situation with what I thought was a considerable degree of finesse and ingenuity, when my very empathic housemate appeared on the scene to see how I was doing. She said in an astonished tone, "Ken, you're bleeding." This seemed to me to be stating the obvious, but I answered yes. "Well, doesn't it hurt?" she asked, whereupon I again refrained from making any smart remarks and simply replied, "Yes, it does." She then said, "Well, aren't you going to have it attended to?" I said I would finish up this batch of mortar and then deal with it. She said something in an incredulous tone that I didn't hear, and stalked back into the house, showing very little sympathy for my wish not to waste mortar. After all, it was her house and her mortar too. It's amazing how some people can't keep things in the proper perspective. The Dungeon. Perhaps I should have called this piece The Accidental Dungeon, because although I knew our big old semi-detached house at 27 Wilton Crescent in the Glebe neighborhood of Ottawa would need a lot of renovations, building a dungeon was never part of the plan. It happened by accident. As part of the renovations, neither did I plan to add rooms to the old house. The 12 rooms we started with should have been enough. But as the work proceeded, it seemed to make sense to add 2 more rooms. The first involved simply putting windows in the second-floor sunroom, which until then had been open to the elements. Not only did this make the sunroom more useful in all seasons, but it helped to keep the adjacent bedroom warmer. The second added room came about because the kitchen in the old house was small and inadequate. As part of the kitchen rebuild, I punched through the outer wall to make a bump out for the fridge. Next, I closed in the back porch to provide additional storage and to place our small chest deep freezer. Unfortunately, the structure supporting the porch was weak, so I crawled underneath to reinforce it. I planned to reinforce it with some new floor joists supported by posts sunk into the ground. This meant that I had to remove some earth below the porch, but once I started digging, I kept going until I could stand with headroom to spare. Eventually, I put in a concrete floor and concrete steps leading down, together with a bicycle storage building above the steps, with a hinged floor for access. I began calling the space down there a dungeon. That meant I had to revise the room count for the old house to 14 rooms and a dungeon. I was confident that we had the only house in the glebe with a dungeon. The back porch stroke bicycle storage stroke dungeon combination was a rather bizarre structure, but it functioned well enough, and I had a lot of fun once various kids in the 6 to 10 age range heard about it. Some of them kept turning up asking to see the dungeon. I was pleased to show it to them, and cooked up stories about how the prisoners being held down there were always keen to have visitors. Elsewhere in these writings, I described the ingle nook, the chimney corner, off the living room, which leads me to ask how many Ottawa houses have both an ingle nook and a dungeon. No wonder I was sorry to leave that house. Pity. Our old house was only 1.5 blocks from Lansdowne Park, where an annual exhibition had been held for more than 100 years. There was insufficient parking on the grounds, and on-street parking was restricted during the X, which led to a big parking problem in our neighborhood at that time. In violation of a city bylaw, some neighbors took advantage of the situation and offered parking in their backyards and on their front lawns, charging $10 per hour. This was in the 1990s. Marcel, our neighbor in the next house to the west, who was quite keen on making money and even more keen on not spending it, decided to add to his wealth by offering parking in his backyard, accessed from the back alley where he could accommodate 2 cars, thus making $20 per hour.
He attracted 2 customers almost right away and took their keys from them in case he had to jockey the cars before they both returned. Sure enough, the people needing the front car returned before the people belonging to the back car did, so Marcel had to move the back car out of the way to allow the front car out. Unfortunately for Marcel, the car he was jockeying had a tricky accelerator, so at one point the accelerator stuck full on. The car took charge of the situation, roared ahead, slammed into a hydro pole, and came to a stop partway through the alleyway gate of our neighbor immediately to the east. We were the middle house during all this activity, and were unaffected except for the entertainment value. We later heard that it cost Marcel $4,000 to repair the damaged car. Don, our neighbor to the east, repaired his gate himself and didn't charge Marcel anything, which was the only good news Marcel had arising from the incident. A week or so later, I was 15 feet up on a ladder painting a window frame when Don came into his backyard. I thought I would demonstrate good neighborliness by expressing some sympathy about Marcel's unfortunate accident. So I said, so Marcel probably took in about $60 on the parking, but had to spend $4,000 to have the damaged car repaired. So his net loss was about $3,940 on the enterprise. Isn't that unfortunate? Don glanced up at me and removed the pipe from his mouth and said, pity. It's not a good idea to laugh that hard when you're 15 feet above the ground standing on a ladder. Fortunately, I managed to hang on, so I'm here to tell this story.
Red light corner. The china cabinet built into the wall in one corner of our dining room was not in good condition. It was badly out of square, the glass door wouldn't close properly, and a lot of cold air poured in around the door during the winter. The china cabinet project had been on my to-do list for a long time, but one summer I finally got working on it.
I gutted the cabinet completely, ripping everything out to the exterior brick wall of the house in preparation for insulating the space properly and rebuilding the cabinet square and true. It was quite a complicated project, and weeks stretched into months, during which time our dining room featured an ugly gaping hole in the wall in the corner. Most of the people who sat around our dining room table during this period were family or close friends, and they simply remarked on the progress I was or wasn't making on the china cabinet project, after which we would talk of other things. But in a moment of uncharacteristically bad judgment, Carol agreed to host a dinner for some people from her church. I believe the project was called Host a Dinner for People You Hope Never to See Again, although I may not have the title exactly right. In any event, Carol was somewhat uptight about the dinner and embarrassed by the unsightly hole in the wall. She urged me to do something about it. I decided to get creative, which is usually not a good idea. I should have just waited till the impulse went away. We had a hanging basket chair at the time, so I hung it in the opening, put a red bulb in my trouble light, which I then hung inside the chair, with the light facing towards the rough outside wall. The result was quite eye-catching, if I do say myself. It looked, how shall I put this, bizarre. The idea was that it would be a conversation piece, and she agreed that it might indeed be so, and that was the best she could hope for it. The 3 couples arrived. We visited stiffly over drinks in the living room, and then moved to the dining room, where we visited stiffly over dinner. The bizarre creation glowed redly in the corner, while the 6 of them studiously averted their eyes. I was damned if I was going to say anything about it, and Carol couldn't think of any way to introduce the topic, so the creation in the corner dominated the room the whole time, without a word being said about it. We had a final stiff little visit at the front door, said our cheery goodbyes, and they left. After they left, C and I just stood and shook our heads. Anyone else in our circle of family and friends would have demanded to know what I thought I was doing with that stupid-looking setup, and it would have become the joke of the evening. But not this lot. They were, how shall I put it, too stiff.
Whistle while you work. I like this story for 2 reasons, because it happened to a friend of mine, and because it could just as easily have happened to me. My good buddy Keith Smith and his family lived for several years in what had been the official residence of the former Manitoba Lieutenant Governor.
This large, gracious wood frame and stucco dwelling, built in 1914, was originally known as McGregor House, and later as Gwenmar. At some point, the Smiths put a carpet down in the hallway outside the main floor bathroom. The problem then was that the bathroom door rubbed on the new carpet. Keith, a dedicated do-it-yourselfer, took the door off with a view to cutting half an inch off the bottom. It was a beautiful summer day as Keith carried the door out, set it across 2 sawhorses, and plugged his skill saw into an extension cord, clamped a straight edge across the door, and removed half an inch from the bottom of the door. He carried the door back into the house, hung it in place, and triumphantly swung the door to see how well it cleared the carpet. It didn't. It still scraped along the carpet. Obviously, I didn't cut enough off, Keith said to himself. So he repeated the extension cord and skill saw routine on that beautiful summer day and carried the door back into the house, muttering to himself, that should do it. The door still scraped along the carpet as before. What a dedicated do-it-yourselfer must then do is sit back and analyze the situation. But as Keith was sitting back, he happened to glance up and saw that there was a 1-inch gap at the top of the door. Even those of my readers who have the good sense not to be do-it-yourselfers will be able to figure out what had gone wrong. Keith figured it out too and decided enough was enough, that the bathroom needed some additional ventilation anyway, and the carpet would just have to like it or lump it. The title of this story is from the 1937 Disney movie Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Whistle while you work.